Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Strategies to Successfully Address Digital Health Challenges. My name is Erica Carbajal with Becker's Hospital Review. On behalf of Becker's, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we start off, I'm going to walk through just a few quick housekeeping instructions here. So first, we will begin today's webinar with a presentation and a panel, and we will have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. So you can go ahead and use the Q&A box that you should see on your screen to submit any questions that you might have throughout the webinar. Today's session is also being recorded, so it will be available after the event. And you can go ahead and use the same link that you used to log into today's webinar to access that recording once it's available. And if at any time you don't see your slides moving, or if you're having trouble with the audio, just try refreshing your browser, and you can also use that same Q&A box to submit any technical questions that you have. We're here to help with those. And with that, I'm pleased to welcome today's discussion panel. First, we have Dr. Sunny Coley. He is a critical care physician at Health and Healthcare, co-founder and chief medical officer at CloudDX. And next, we have Robert Call, founder and CEO at President at CloudDX. Dr. Coley and Robert, thank you again so much for being here today. I'll now go ahead and turn the floor over to you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Erica. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to talking today about digital health challenges and sharing strategies that you can implement to overcome barriers and ensure that your digital health program is successful. These are strategies that we at CloudDX have helped many clients navigate and implement. We aren't here to talk about our solutions specifically. We want you to come away with solutions and ideas that can benefit your organization, no matter how you're building your digital health solution and no matter which provider you choose or are currently using. That being said, we do want to share a few details about CloudDX so you know where we're coming from and where we are drawing this expertise from. Our mission at CloudDX is to make healthcare better for everyone. We believe that with more data and better data about patients remotely, we can help create better outcomes and be more efficient and lower costs overall. Our connected health platform is actually in use by healthcare providers and care teams across North America to manage chronic disease and to enable aging in place and to deliver post-surgical care. Providers partnering with us have achieved better outcomes in third-party clinical studies and have seen also very high patient and provider satisfaction scores. In addition to that, CloudDX has won a number of awards. We're co-winner of something called the Qualcomm Tricorder X Prize. We also just recently were named a winner of the 2021 Edison Awards, and we've been named a Fast Company World-Changing Idea finalist. Speaking today are myself. I'm the CEO and founder of CloudDX. I personally have over 30 years of experience as an entrepreneur and over 12 years of experience in digital healthcare. CloudDX is my 6th startup overall. I have a bachelor's degree in biology and a certificate in operations strategy from MIT. CloudDX is the second public company that I've been a CEO of. Joining me today to share his experience and expertise is Dr. Sunny Coley, our Chief Medical Officer. Sunny is an attending physician in intensive care and internal medicine at Oakville Trafalgar Memorial Hospital in Ontario, Canada, and also an assistant clinical professor of medicine at McMaster University, also in Ontario, Canada. Fun fact, in 2008, Sunny was an astronaut candidate at the Canadian Space Agency, and when he was doing that, he was awarded a scholarship to the Johnson Space Center. So from the point of view of the agenda today, we're going to be reviewing some strategies to successfully address digital health challenges. We're going to explore RPM, or remote patient monitoring, and why we believe it's crucial to better healthcare delivery for both patients and providers. We're also going to review some current challenges in delivering remote patient monitoring, including connectivity, data accuracy, user experience, and of course, reimbursement. We're going to look at why these are challenges, perhaps how to mitigate some of them, and how to be successful with a virtual care program that includes remote patient monitoring. Along the way, we're going to talk about some of the CPT codes and reimbursement or billing codes that can be utilized in coordination with RPM. So our goal, again, is to share with you some strategies and just some success stories that we've seen as providers of these technologies across North America. Just so we have a common language of terms here, I'd just like to speak to sort of 4 terms we're going to talk about during our presentation. So telehealth in particular is a fairly broad term. The Health Resources Services Administration defines telehealth as the use of electronic information and telecommunications technologies to support long-distance clinical health care, patient and professional health-related education, public health, health administration. So telehealth includes video conferencing. It includes something called store and forward telehealth, which means it's not synchronous, it's asynchronous. Essentially, this is healthcare at a distance, so it's a broad term. Digital health includes other aspects of delivering healthcare, mobile health or mHealth, health information technology or health IT. This might encompass wearable devices, it might encompass Bluetooth devices, it might encompass personalized medicine in addition to a sort of direct clinician-to-patient relationship. So in the world of digital health, we're not just talking about a two-way video conversation or a text messaging conversation or a phone conversation. We're now embracing the movement of data, the uploading of data to electronic medical records, and even all the way to the frontiers of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So digital health is a very broad term. When we speak of remote patient monitoring now, we're talking about a coordinated system that uses one or more home-based or mobile monitoring devices to transmit vital sign data or information on activities of daily living or vital sign information that is then subsequently reviewed by a healthcare professional. And in the context of reimbursement, those devices need to be FDA cleared, and the connectivity between the devices and the clinician has to be wireless and automated. So that is the definition of RPM, or remote patient monitoring. Many people have heard the term CPT codes. CPT codes stand for Current Procedural Terminology. This is a system developed by the American Medical Association as a standardized coding system for services and procedures to enable the proper billing and payment for those services. CPT codes are used by Medicare, Medicaid, and also, in many cases, private insurance companies in order to manage billing. So with that, now that we're on the same page here, I'd like to now invite Dr. Coley to talk to us a little bit about the impact and influence of COVID-19.
Certainly, thanks, Rob. You really set the stage for this discussion, so thank you. It makes it easier when you table set the definition. So with that in place, we've all seen since the beginning of the pandemic this exponential rise or increase in the usage of digital healthcare across all of its various forms that Rob articulated. In fact, it's so important that on both sides of the border, both from Canada and in the U.S. with the CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid, there was guidance that was released and published early in the pandemic, March 2020, that made it even easier for providers to make virtual care or remote patient monitoring the norm. RPM was allowed to be provided to both new and established patients for the duration of the pandemic for both COVID and non-COVID conditions. In fact, at HIMSS in 2020, Tyler Fletcher, he's a consultant for Global Data. He said that we've seen providers turn to RPM faster than ever before. I've certainly experienced that in my own practice. I work in a fairly traditional Canadian hospital, and we're slow on the uptake when it comes to innovation, and I just saw an exponential increase in the use of virtual care at my institution, which was a shock to me personally. And also as the Chief Medical Officer of Cloud DX, I saw an exponential rise in organizations asking for our platform and how it could be deployed for both COVID and non-COVID use cases. Interestingly, telehealth and RPM have been of tremendous value since the beginning of the pandemic for all sorts of reasons, some which are obvious and some which aren't so obvious. A perfect example, when I'm working as an internist at my hospital, usually this room, it's a typical Canadian hospital, it's full of patients, there's many staff around. It's a perfect opportunity for a droplet-borne pathogen like COVID to spread. And so simply by virtue of virtual care, we can eliminate the spread between patients and crossing over to healthcare workers and between healthcare workers. So that in and of itself was an exponential leap and important in mitigating the pandemic. But there's many other ways that virtual care can influence and improve care. We saw clients utilize RPM to decant patients at home. So those that were being discharged from the emergency room were sort of marginal and needed to be monitored because there was a suspicion that they could deteriorate. They would be decanted with an RPM platform or set up with some virtual care to monitor them, and make sure that they're staying safe. And at the same time, implement mechanisms to have them come back to the hospital in an efficient manner that would reduce the work burden on the staff and healthcare workers if they do deteriorate. Likewise, patients that were being discharged from hospital, who were being decanted to make room for COVID patients. We saw centralized virtual monitoring of those patients, and a lot of organizations turned to companies like ours to use a virtual platform and a dashboard to monitor these patients in an efficient way. So there's certainly pandemic was certainly one contributor to the growth, but there's other drivers that were driving the uptake of virtual care in the era of the pandemic. That's just a need for operational efficiency. Staff is at a premium now, and so we need to leverage the nursing resources and allied healthcare resources that we have. And so using a platform that allows one nurse to monitor hundreds of patients at a time in a very efficient way it only aids and abets that mandate. There's also additionally a growing aging population who require additional healthcare support, and they were left to their own devices during the pandemic because existing face-to-face support systems were no longer in play. And so there's a demand for RPM services on that side as well. So certainly, when you look at this, the impact and influence of COVID-19, this particular slide highlights one use case in the monitoring of COVID patients, both stable and unstable, and decanting. But there's a myriad of use cases, and I'm sure when you think about your organization, you could probably think about the different areas of need in your organization and how virtual care could play a role in improving your efficiency and or patient or organizational outcomes. If we could advance the slide, that'd be great. Thank you. So on that note, I spoke to outcomes and the patient perspective. Well, here's an example of how telemedicine isn't simply a temporary solution. So I have in my internal medicine clinic, I have several chronic complicated patients who live in jurisdictions that are quite far away. And after we started implementing virtual care and they had remote patient monitoring set up, they asked the obvious question: why do I ever need to come back to see you, Dr. Coley? It's a 3-hour drive both ways. I usually have to have a loved one take me. There's parking costs. There's all sorts of logistical considerations. It's not easy for me to go there and wait. I feel a bit claustrophobic, and I have a bit of agoraphobia. I live on a farm. So why can't we just make this a permanent way of doing business? And certainly, me as a sort of an early adopter and someone that works with I co-founded a virtual care company, that was music to my ears. But for other care providers, it's like almost an affront to how they were used to providing care, because they view telemedicine as a temporary solution. Well, in fact, in many surveys, both north and south of the border, upwards of 80% of patients expect to use telemedicine services permanently. So that's an interesting observation that we need to take into account as organizations that are planning virtual care platforms. Put it simply, if you make the mistake, as we have observed, if you make the mistake as being an organization that implements something on a temporary basis, thinking that, oh, this can be temporary, so we don't need to put in all the bells and whistles. We don't need to be careful on how it's implemented. We don't need to be at a microscopic level ensuring the workflow is optimal for both patient and provider. You'll make the mistake of putting something in that will really become a burden down the road. So you have to do it right the first time. I think I'll leave the next slide to Rob.
Thank you, Sunny. So when we consider how we go forward from here and what the future of virtual care is going to be, as Sunny mentions, we're coming out of a unique and really an extraordinary situation. As of March 2020 and the onslaught of COVID-19, hospitals and care providers kind of went into survival mode. The statistics are startling. Multi-thousand% increases in telehealth visits, and an incredible sea change that saw entire multi-thousand patient programs literally stood up almost overnight in the course of a few weeks, which is typically not how hospital systems and care providers work. Typically things are a little more measured than that. It has been a giant living lab, though. Experiments have been done. Papers are being written. It's exciting to be part of that. But now what we're finding ourselves is that the real challenges are around those workflows and making sure that those efficiency increases actually come true, making sure that the workflow for clinicians is appropriate and is in fact an improvement over the status quo, and of course the patient experience as well. So what we're going to do now is we're going to really kind of dive into an important challenge with virtual care, which is what we like to call connectivity. I'll let Sunny speak to that.
So yes, connectivity is an important aspect of my life, both as an ICU and internal medicine physician, because I'm exposed to the realities of telehealth and RPM and what it can mean to both patients and doctors. So it's important we look at the current challenges, and I think I want to start with connectivity. The vital importance of connectivity and its impact on patient outcomes was exposed to me firsthand long before digital health was even a thing, back in 2010 when I was volunteering in a hospital in Haiti just after the earthquake that impacted Port-au-Prince. If you remember, 250,000 people tragically died instantly during that earthquake. In the aftermath, scores more died because of the vacuum that was access to healthcare. And 1 million were also instantly made homeless. So you can just imagine what it looked like at the time. It was catastrophic. It was apocalyptic. And certainly at this little volunteer hospital that I was working at, it was small by our standards in North America, but by Haiti standards at the time, because the major hospitals in Port-au-Prince had been destroyed or were not able to provide care because of critical issues, we became the only hospital on the block. So even though we were operating in a little suburb of Port-au-Prince, as the Field of Dreams analogy, if you build it, they will come. So certainly that was the case here. And on one particular day, there was a woman that arrived at our hospital with chest pain. She was a smoker. She was, in fact, a volunteer from Florida. She was a nurse there, and with the subprime mortgage disaster, I'm dating myself here, but you all remember that, she decided to pick up her family and move to Haiti and do good work there. Gave up her home. So here she is working in Haiti, doing good work, and now she has chest pain. And so she's faced with a dilemma. She can either spend her life savings and be helivacked with the assistance of the American Embassy to Miami to be evaluated for her chest pain, or take her chances at our little hospital. So the irony of this is I'm working at the most modern hospital at the time in Haiti, and we didn't even have a functioning ECG machine. And for the non-clinical people in the room, that's like being an accountant and not having a pencil. So fortunately, I was with two very smart engineering students, and together we MacGyvered, using a Canadian reference, or we jerry-rigged a broken ECG machine to allow me to diagnose her problem. And as we reflected on our work later that evening, we realized the world could really use connectivity, a smartphone-based, affordable diagnostic technology that leverages the cloud to make diagnosis remotely. This sounds like it's very commonplace now, but at the time it was almost a blasphemic idea. Something that could be used by anyone, anytime, anywhere to make healthcare better for everyone, not just the patient, but for the provider. And that's certainly become our mandate at CloudDX. However, it's important to remember that a device alone doesn't solve the problem. We've learned this with organizations that have adopted virtual care just by buying devices en masse through Amazon or Alibaba, thinking that'll solve the problem. It takes a lot more than that. Even though modern mobile technology and advanced analytics in cloud-based infrastructure provide unprecedented and seamless collaboration and information sharing, there's redundancies, inefficiencies, communication breakdowns that exist. I'll give you an example. I won't name the institution, but there's an organization nearby me in the Greater Toronto area, which of course is a massive metropolis, that decided to adopt virtual care. And so their solution was hand out oximeters paid for by the government that weren't connected, and then implement a quick workflow to start monitoring COVID patients because their hospital had been overwhelmed and they were operating beyond capacity. So the solution was, one of my patients who happens to have Parkinson's disease was implemented into this COVID at-home monitoring program, was tasked with using this oximeter, put the oximeter on their finger, and then had to manually write down the measurement, email it to a nurse who was operating in the hospital. That nurse would then manually enter that data into an Excel spreadsheet email that spreadsheet to a respiratory therapist who would then spend 30% of their time, or a 0.3 full-time equivalent of their time during the day, looking at the spreadsheet and making phone calls. Now, you can just imagine in that workflow the opportunities for error, communication breakdowns, redundancy, and inefficiency. There's a better way. So the fundamental problem is not devices. It's a technology problem. In fact, it's a connectivity problem. So your RPM solution, if you decide to implement an RPM solution for your particular organizational problem or pain point, it's about gathering important data with your provider, your platform provider, needing to know how that data will be flowed, reviewed, by who, when, and how frequently. It takes a complete solution that involves both technology and people, and doing it in a way that improves your hospital efficiencies, improves people's time, and improves outcomes. You know, I had a lot more to say on this issue, but I feel like I may be overstating it. So, Rob, do you want to just move on to slide 9, or is there anything else you'd like me to talk about?
No, I think that's a very solid point. So obviously, step 1, connectivity and the workflow around moving data from where it starts in the patient's hands to the clinician where it can be actioned, and then that feedback loop that generates an early intervention or an efficiency that generates better care. That's the entire purpose of what we're talking about today. But I do want to talk a little bit about data accuracy as well. You know, we're in a data world. Not all data is good data is, I think, a kind of a very sort of obvious quote. But, you know, when it comes to using patient-generated data or data generated in the field remotely in order to make clinical decisions that will directly affect patient care, there has always been a bit of an uphill battle because it's outside of the experience of a lot of clinicians. You know, patient-generated data was often considered to be less accurate potentially, or less trustable, because the conditions under which it was gathered were not controlled. And as Sunny just described, if you can imagine a person who has an off-the-shelf piece of medical technology like a blood pressure cuff or a pulse oximeter or a thermometer even, who's taking their readings and then manually writing them down and somehow transcribing them, and then later on transmitting them in some way, potentially over the phone or even literally on paper to clinicians, lots and lots of room for error. You know, companies like CloudDX have been working on this data accuracy problem from almost the beginning of remote patient monitoring. And so it starts with the idea of obviously using FDA-cleared devices that are approved by regulators and have that medical clearance. But then the idea is, of course, to be able to make sure that the data is being gathered correctly. So there's several aspects to this you're going to want to consider. One aspect is training the patient to make sure that they gather that information in a way that is both optimized and also appropriate. And a good example of this is a blood pressure cuff. A lot of folks have seen blood pressure cuffs used, but they may not have owned one. And so when a person goes to take their blood pressure, there's a series of steps that need to be taken. For example, to get the best possible reading from a blood pressure cuff, you should be sitting down. You should have your feet flat on the floor. Your back should be straight. Your bladder should be empty, because these things have been proven in studies to affect blood pressure. You should also wait for 15 minutes to allow your system to settle before you take that reading. And then when you do take the reading, you should make sure you don't move or talk or in any way sort of disturb the body while the reading is being taken. Once you follow those steps, you're going to get a pretty good blood pressure reading. But if you don't follow those steps, then the reading is less precise. So that's just an example. You know, so patient training and patient education is a big part of ensuring that you have good data. Another aspect of it is simply the electronic transmission of data. One reason why TPT codes for remote patient monitoring insist that the devices used to transmit their data by Bluetooth to the clinical dashboard or to the electronic medical record is to remove that human error of transcription. Sometimes people write digits backwards and so on and so forth. So having a solid, well-established and, if possible, clinically validated process for moving the data from the patient into the electronic platform is and also something that very much to consider. And then there's another step even beyond that, and devices are starting to appear today that gather data about themselves in the process of being used. This is called metadata. And so for those who aren't familiar with that term, metadata gives you some insight into what was happening with that device as it was operating. Were the batteries fully charged, and was the voltage correct? For an inflatable blood pressure cuff, a good example is, did the cuff inflate properly and deflate properly? So what were the inflation and deflation pressures? That connectivity from the device to the platform, did that happen the way it was supposed to? And that can be measured. You can measure, packet loss and so on. So the optimum solution then is a device that, or a system, a platform in fact, that is able to give you some knowledge of the health of the devices that are being used out there in the field. This is, the most modern devices out there, and I'm sure you won't be shocked to hear that CloudDX is a pioneer in this area. So we know a lot about this because one of the things that we are excited about at CloudDX is that our devices do in fact record all the metadata from when they make those measurements to give the users, both patients and clinicians, a very strong indication of the precision and accuracy of the data that's been gathered. That leads to trustable data. That means clinicians can take that data at face value and make clinical decisions based on it without having to repeat those measurements in an in-person visit. That's critical to success in a virtual care or remote patient monitoring solution. So that's our take on data accuracy, and I'm going to let Sunny speak a little bit to user experience.
Certainly, yeah. So when we look at user experience, there's several things you have to look at very carefully. So the first is that recognize that young people are far advanced in comparison to their older counterparts, and expect their digital devices to work like the apps they've become accustomed to. So they have to be seamless. They can't be buggy, and they have to be available on their devices that they're using every day. So that's important. And that's something that, companies like CloudDX and others are taking very seriously. So, making sure that the technology is seamless, that the platform works well. And so it's an integrated and effortless user experience is important. But for older patients, the needs are different. They need to work simply because older people are discouraged from a telehealth and RPM perspective if it seems intimidating or difficult to use. So having a platform that meets the needs of younger people while simultaneously meeting the needs of the older people is not easy. It's taken a lot of failure for a company like CloudDX to finally get it right. But it's important that we really focus on that older demographic because they're the ones creating a drastic shift in the healthcare needs of many Americans. They're driving the need. According to the National Council on Aging, about 80% of older adults have at least chronic disease. In fact, it's more like 2 because they're aging and they just acquire more and more chronic illness. It's a burden that's not getting smaller, it's getting bigger. And that burden places additional burden, for lack of a better word, not only on themselves, but on their families and the healthcare system as a whole. So for your virtual care or remote patient monitoring program to work, it's got to appeal to the demographic you're targeting, number one. And number two, patient education has to be priority because that's the only way you'll be able to ensure compliance and also for them to embrace the technology because they understand the value of it. And we have a lot of anecdotes with patients that have used our platform that speak to that. Initial failures and eventually successes when we got it right.
Yes, so I want to jump in and just mention that it's a pervasive myth that the older generations, people above the age of 65 or even 75, are somehow technophobic. We hear that all the time. Oh, I don't know if my older patients, my older demographic is going to take to this. I don't know if they'd be interested in this. They're not really technically sort of educated or not technically savvy. And we've actually determined that's an ageist myth. That's not actually true. And if you think about it for a moment, logically it makes sense. Our older relatives, grandparents, and parents in some cases, they're the ones who pioneered technology. These are folks who live from the age of the automobile through the airplane, through the television, through the computer. They are the masters at technology. So it's not true that older patients are resistant to technology. What is true is that older patients are impatient with technology that doesn't work, as Sunny just mentioned. And so when technology is properly designed for that group of consumers, if you will, we see extraordinarily high levels of engagement and extraordinarily high levels, like much higher than 95% engagement and compliance. Just a quick anecdote. One of CloudDX's deployments has been running now for over 3 years. The oldest patient on that deployment is now over the age of 100. He joined us. He became a user of our technology at the age of 97. He literally uses that technology every single day. He almost never misses a reading, and he loves it. He is absolutely thrilled with it because it gives him that knowledge and feedback of his own health that he had never imagined he would get in his life. So we believe that there is no age group that it does not qualify for remote patient monitoring, and that remote patient monitoring and virtual care in general cannot be successful with. So that's a very important point. Okay. Let's move on to reimbursement. So obviously, virtual care and remote monitoring technology has proven itself. It's proven itself before the pandemic. There were many studies have shown time and again that virtual care can be very effective when deployed correctly. Studies have also shown virtual care, when not deployed correctly, can be confusing and can have a lower ROI because of the complications involved. But of course, getting paid and being reimbursed for deploying this care is of primary importance. So, we're going to discuss at this moment in the U.S. context CPT codes for remote patient monitoring in particular. And so, in December of 2020, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services (CMS) released its 2021 Medicare Physician Fee Schedule final rule, wherein they discuss the latest codes for RPM, or for remote patient monitoring. So those codes, for example, include CPT 99457 and CPT 99458. These are codes that reimburse clinicians for interacting with the data generated from the patient. So reviewing the data and then communicating with the patient about the data. That can be a conversation that occurs in real time. In other words, a two-way interaction, either on a video consult or in some cases even on an audio phone call. CMS originally stated that it expected all the time spent towards these codes to be in that interactive communication, but then there was a public comment and it was determined that that didn't make any sense. You had to review the data first before you could have the conversation with the patient. So on January 19th, that ruling was clarified, and so the time that you're billing with these codes associated with analyzing the physiological data from the remote patient monitoring solution includes care management services, as well as the time spent communicating with the patient, or that synchronous real-time interaction. I mentioned a little bit earlier that there are requirements for the type of devices used in reimbursed RPM. For example, those devices, as I mentioned, need to be FDA cleared, obviously, but they also need to be digital, and they need to be wireless. They need to communicate with the electronic medical record or the patient clinician dashboard in a way that is automated. Other rules that have been modified or been changed since the pandemic came along, one rule in particular was the rule that in order to enroll a patient in remote patient monitoring, a clinician had to first have had at least one face-to-face consult with the patient. Obviously, in the COVID-19 context, that became impossible in 2020, so that rule was relaxed, and that relaxation, it appears now, has been made permanent. A very important rule around reimbursement for RPM in this context, two important points. One is that now, we're talking about remote patient monitoring for patients at the discretion of the clinician. Older codes that were in place before the pandemic and in place before 2020, like 99091, actually stated that patients needed to have 2 or more chronic conditions diagnosed in order to qualify for virtual remote patient monitoring and virtual care in particular. But these new codes don't require that. They're in a different class of CPT code. So there's no requirement for any specific diagnosis here. If it's deemed by the clinician to be medically relevant, then it's permissible to prescribe and bill for physiological monitoring or RPM. Also, the codes have been evolving since they were very first initiated with regards to who, in fact, has to do the interpretation of the information. At the very beginning of this process, it was deemed that clinicians themselves, and in fact, doctors, needed to be the ones, or people who were literally in the building reporting to the doctor needed to be reviewing the data. It became obvious over time that that was not a good workflow, so CMS changed the rules, and now both auxiliary personnel as well as directly supervised personnel are able to review the information and bill for them. I'll talk about 2 more points here, and then, this is obviously a much bigger subject. There's endless amounts of conversation we could have about the ins and outs of billing within various different CMS regions, but 2 more points. In order to qualify for reimbursement, remote patient monitoring data needs to be gathered by the patient on at least 16 days of the 30-day cycle. And I'm going to back up for a moment here. I should have mentioned that these codes we're talking about are billed on a rolling 30-day basis. So from the day that the patient is enrolled in the program and it's prescribed to them, you can bill for that 30 days later. Within that 30-day window, though, so you're not billing on a monthly basis, you're billing on a 30-day basis. Within that 30-day window, patients need to gather information at least 16 out of those 30 days. So compliance is important. That means when you're choosing an RPM vendor or partner and you're looking at deploying RPM, it's very helpful if you have a way to measure compliance, and in particular, an automated way to measure compliance with a very easy workflow so that you can very quickly identify non-compliant patients that need an extra 1 or 2 days of data before that billing window closes, so you don't wind up with patients who only have 14 days when you could have had patients who have 16 days. And of course, you miss the opportunity to bill in that 30-day cycle. So that's a very important point. Okay, one other point, and then we'll move on a little bit here. But it is very important to note that a little bit unusually, CMS allows clinicians and practitioners to stack these codes. You're permitted to bill. You can't double dip, but you are permitted to bill for the equipment code, which is 99457. You're permitted to bill for the monitoring codes, 99453, 99454, and so on. And you can stack those codes with other chronic care management codes like 99091, and even codes for other services. So I guess all of this comes down to this point, which is when you're thinking about deploying a remote patient monitoring or a vital sign program or a virtual care program, it's important to work with a partner who has a lot of knowledge about this subject. It's very important to work with someone who has has examples they can share of how this has worked with other clients and can walk you through the intricacies of this if it's not something you've really addressed before in your practice or in your institution, so that you get up to speed as quickly as possible and you are able to capture the maximum reimbursed amounts allowable. So that's our position on that subject. And now I'm going to ask Sunny to give us a little bit more of a clinician insight on other things we should look for in an RPM program.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Rob. So you know what? We really want to focus on take-home messages that you can take back to your organization when you start pontificating what program you want to implement and how it should look like. So just some very basic, fundamental questions you should be asking. And we've seen the mistakes, which is why we really encourage you to take this list to heart. Consider both your internal and external stakeholders. So if you just did a cursory review, you think, oh, just the nurses, the clinicians, patients, But if you really do a deeper dive, it's a lot more detail. It's a lot more. The list is more comprehensive than that. And I encourage you to think about everyone involved in the chain, the value chain from patient to provider, both the technical support people, your privacy people, your legal people, all the stakeholders that will be responsible for ensuring that your RPM program is both safe, effective, and successful. You also want to decide which patients you will roll out the program with and at which point you will expand. Be very defined about that. Target milestones. If you don't, you may have the issue where you've implemented an RPM program, and we've seen this with our own eyes, and it's a very slow take-up because you're not driven to meet certain goals or milestones and targets. So the entire system is sort of operating in slow-mo. So what are those goals and milestones? It's up to your organization to decide, but we encourage you to, if you're going to build it, you don't want a 10% change. The whole point of digital technology is to drive exponential change. And so think exponentially. Identify those goals. What are you hoping to see occur from each subset of patients? Be specific. What are your subjective outcomes? Was it a positive experience? Was it feelings of positive affect and well-being? Feeling connected? Less feelings of social isolation? Are those important to your organization? Are there more harder endpoints like reduced visits to the ER, reduced virtual care visits, improved hard outcomes like related to morbidity and mortality? What does success look like to your organization? Be audacious, articulate them, and then make sure your virtual care program can meet those objectives. And certainly they're evolving at an exponential pace, as I've mentioned, so they should be able to. What's the relationship with your RPM and your EHR? That's question number 4. Does your RPM interface connect directly with the patient's EHR? Your program may fit into an existing EHR workflow, or maybe have its own separate workflow. Every organization is different. But I encourage you to not think very narrowly and think it must interface with our EHR so our clinicians can look at it using the same platform. That may seem intuitive, but it actually may end up being very clunky, and it may be an impossible thing to achieve with your organization's EHR or perhaps your organization's technical bandwidth because everybody's so busy right now. So think about that carefully. And number 5, when looking at providers, you will want to ask, are there any conditions you specialize in? Is your remote patient monitoring platform specific to COPD, mental health, diabetes, wound care, post-surgical patients and monitoring in the acute phase, congestive heart failure? How does your hardware and software work together? What hardware is provided and who's the manufacturer? Is it Canadian, American? Is it approved by the FDA? Is it endorsed by the American Heart Association? Those are important questions because we've seen massive deployments with very inferior hardware, and it's destined to fail. Or the data that you're procuring from that hardware is not accurate, and yet you're making clinical decisions on that hardware. So it's really critical that you vet that. What does the support look like? Does your RPM provider interface with patients regarding the setup and troubleshooting? So having a company that has a relationship with your patients on the technical side, I think is an important value add because, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about the technology, it's about the people too. That interface and that workflow, seamless workflow between people and technology is what makes a successful virtual care deployment or RPM deployment. And what is the user experience like for patients? We spoke about that earlier as one of the challenges. What does the dashboard look like? So in some RPM platform instances, they provide the patient with an app. They provide patients with the opportunity to interface with that app, collecting survey information, symptom information, and vital signs. But on the back end, the clinicians don't really have an intuitive way to look at all of that data in a way that improves their efficiency. So is your RPM provider, do they have a dashboard? And what does that dashboard look like? Are there automatic alerts and notifications, thresholds that can be set and personalized that improve their workflow? So they have to spend less time looking at the screen and spend more time just focusing on those that are having exceptions to the alerts that you've programmed. Certainly our company has a very intuitive dashboard, and we've gotten great marks for it. It's taken a lot of work to get it to where it is now. As I mentioned, a lot of failure has driven its development. But so make sure you look at your RPM provider's dashboard because they're all different. How does the data get to clinicians? And lastly, what references does your RPM provider have? Who is currently using their solution? Have they won any RFPs? How big or small is the organization that organizations that they're serving? Because you want to find a provider that is perhaps used to dealing with an organization of your size, your stature, your need set. And then lastly, once you choose that provider, document the workflow, educate the patients and the clinicians. Make sure there's a lot of training ahead of time. So when it's deployed and you've articulated the goals and the milestones, everybody's on the same page. If you could go to the next slide, that would be great.
Absolutely. Whoops. The next slide this is us.
There you go. So I'll really quickly recap, Rob, if that's okay, and then I'll leave it to you. As a group, we've discussed the benefits of RPM, what they can provide for both patient and provider in your organization, both regarding COVID-19 and otherwise. There are many uses for remote patient monitoring. I think by way of example, a large institution in Canada, Hamilton Health Sciences, which is associated with McMaster University, decided during the pandemic that providing post-surgical care is important because these patients are used to coming back to the hospital for clinic appointments or to the emergency room for post-surgical problems, can no longer do so. So they quickly implemented a virtual care program. But it happened to be set up by some of the brightest researchers on the planet. So instead of just doing it and seeing what the outcomes are like, they decided to be very clinical, very academic, and set up a massive randomized control trial that randomized 1,000 patients to those on the platform and those standard of care, and that data is going to be published. And sure enough, that's one new evolving use case, which is the post-surgical use case. Managing chronic diseases is a traditional use case that you've probably seen and heard of, the COPD and heart failure. Enabling aging in place is, and I would argue, a separate use case entirely. It certainly has, its margins are blurred with chronic disease, but it's also its own. So we hope to have the opportunity to come back in the near future and discuss these each in depth with your organization, especially post-surgical, because that seems to be our sweet spot right now. And we have some really exciting developments on that front. As I've mentioned, that large randomized control trial is going to be published soon. We've also explored some of the challenges that come with digital health and RPM specifically. We've looked at potential solutions to these issues, and we hope you've taken some notes, and what they mean for a digital health workflow for your organization. And finally, we looked at the most recent changes to the CPT codes and where you can find further information, and Rob did an excellent job of reviewing that. Rob, over to you.
Thank you, Sunny. Thank you so much. So, obviously, we're here as a resource. We're here to answer questions and help out, and we'd be pleased to do that, whether someone is interested in working with us or not. But there are some great questions in the Q&A section, so I'm going to just jump in right now because we're coming up on 11 minutes left, and I'd like to just answer a few of these questions, and then I'll probably hand a few over to Sunny as well. If we don't get to one of your questions just because of the time, then please, through Becker's, we'll make sure that you can submit those questions and get them answered by email. That's another way we can go here. But one of the questions here from Harvey is a really great question. How do we facilitate access to telemedicine visits for patients who don't have a smartphone or don't have broadband internet in their home? That's certainly true of many older folks. And it also really speaks to the whole concept of sort of social determinants of health and health care, virtual health care equity. We've addressed this problem at CloudDX by supplying a tablet computer with the majority of the connected health kits that we ship. We do that both because it then guarantees that the patient has access to the latest technology. The computer has a cell chip in it, so it's already on the internet. They are not required to have internet at home. The solution is set to go. It also means we can deliver a very seamless user experience for the patient. We use a normal off-the-shelf tablet. We have some Samsung tablets. We have some Acer tablets. It depends on if there is Wi-Fi or not. But in every case, our solution, our mobile app, if you will, is locked down. It's in kiosk mode. That means that the grandkids can't take the tablet and go play games on it or watch Netflix on it or surf Amazon and go shopping on it. It's restricted to healthcare. So that tablet is just used for remote monitoring, telemedicine, and for communicating with physicians and for answering surveys, sometimes even taking wound care photos. So because it's all set up, and the devices are already paired and everything's powered and charged even, when it comes out of the box, it just works. There's no pairing, there's no downloading, there's no logging into Wi-Fi. There's a username and password, which is designed, of course, the patient is part of choosing that password. It's a personalized password. So really, literally, once they're able to enter that password, they're on the system, they're taking readings in literally moments. It's a really great experience for especially older folks when they have that experience, because now they have confidence. They know it's going to work for them. They feel really good about it. So that's how we've addressed that. Another question from Mary Beth, a question about what constitutes HIPAA-compliant technology. That is a whole other seminar, HIPAA compliance, but I will point out a couple of things. There's a lot of misconceptions around what HIPAA actually addresses. HIPAA is a law that initially was designed to address the movement of data back and forth between billing providers and EMRs. But at the end of the day, what we're really looking for is privacy compliance in general, and we're looking for the ability to safeguard patient information so that patients' personal health information, or frankly personal information period, including their names and their addresses and things like that, are not just released to the internet and are not available for various nefarious purposes. The things to look for when you're looking for that, you may not necessarily want to just take at face value someone who says, oh, we're HIPAA compliant. You may want to educate yourself on what HIPAA compliance actually means, and there's lots and lots of resources about that. Ask some pointed questions to make sure that your vendor knows what HIPAA compliance means. And in general, look for technology that's encrypted from the beginning to end. So what that means is that the devices, when they communicate to the internet, do so on an encrypted channel, that if the tablet's communicating with the internet, it's encrypted, that when the data is stored in a server somewhere, the data is stored in an encrypted way. So what they call encrypted in motion and in rest. Ask a lot of questions about encryption. You're going to be looking for things like 128-bit encryption or 256-bit encryption, which is the kind of encryption that banking websites use and credit card processors use. You're going to look for vendors that use a reputable and established cloud-based service, if it's a cloud-based program. So Microsoft Azure is a good one, Google Cloud, or Amazon Web Services. All three of those are acceptable. And also, it's very important that the data is resident within your country. So if you're an American provider, you want to make sure the data is resident in America. It's not being sent to Asia, for example. And if you're Canadian, that the data is resident in Canada, and if you're European, and so on. So ask questions about data residency as well. These are things to look out for. Let's see here. We got some great questions here. And I know we're going to run out of time sooner or later, but we talked about that a little bit. So there's a question from Jennifer about what equipment type is most needed to adapt to digital health. I think we've touched on this a little bit along the way. The most important things about equipment is not so much the minute details, but the things we've talked about. FDA approval is kind of table stakes, obviously. You don't want to be using equipment that's purchased off of a website and doesn't have anything on the box about FDA clearance. Reputable suppliers, of course, are important, but cost is a factor. Some devices used in hospitals, are being adapted for use in telemedicine, but they're very expensive, and possibly that cost is a barrier. So you're looking for a balance between cost and usability, ease of use, and obviously at that FDA clearance. And then what's more important, I think, from our point of view anyway, is that patient and clinician experience. So to what extent is the solution supported? Is it supported in the sense that there's somebody available if that patient has a problem getting on the system, using the technology? Is there somebody there to make sure the batteries stay charged? The last thing you want is somebody with a very serious illness or a serious post-surgical case where literally lives are at stake necessarily, to no longer be able to communicate with your solution, with your system, because the batteries are dead and they forgot to pick up fresh batteries. Little things like that. So if you can find a vendor that pays attention to those details, then you're in good hands and you're going to be able to deploy a solution that's going to work for all your patients. I think that's very, very important. Okay, let's see. I'm going to ask Sunny to speak just a little bit to the clinician side of what a good workflow looks like. You want to speak to that for a minute or two, Sunny?
Certainly, yeah. So when I delegate someone in my organization, for example, some of our higher risk COVID patients that are deployed in our COVID at home program, when we deploy someone in our organization to monitor those patients with the vendor's dashboard, distilling the information down into the most important information, and then making sure that when it's communicated from that provider, whether it's a respiratory therapist or a registered nurse, to the overseeing clinician, in this case an internal medicine doctor or respirologist, that it can be done quickly. So sharing a screen. So here you go, share a screen. I'm just going to send it through your Microsoft Teams that's that's being used by your organization. So whatever platform you're using allows efficient transfer of information. That's an important question, because often the clinician will say, well, quickly send me a snapshot of that patient, how they're doing at home, so I can make a decision. That's just but one example of the workflow issues when you really get into the weeds, the kind of detail you want to flesh out. If you fail in that regard, and I've already articulated an example of a nearby organization that went another route, so how is that information conveyed to the clinician? How can you send the entire spreadsheet that contains the information for all of the patients to the clinician and have them review it? It's just not feasible, and it's going to become more inefficient as opposed to the desired outcome of improving operational efficiencies and improving everyone's day-to-day work life so that the workload is lessened. So I think that's probably a good example. I'll leave you with that for now.
Thanks, Sunny. I guess maybe one more question I'll try to answer, and then other questions we'd love to address later by email or on a one-to-one conversation. But there's a question on legal implications. That does often come up in conversations, when you're dealing with a new way to deliver care. What are the liabilities? What are the legal ramifications of this type of program? And I think that the good news is that, once it became reimbursable by CMS, and once the medical legal infrastructure, if you will, really began to embrace and adopt virtual care and remote monitoring, these questions have all been answered. So typically when we sign a contract with a provider, there's a deployment contract. It outlines the obligations of the provider, the obligations of the vendor. But this is, very similar to any other way of delivering care. It's covered by malpractice insurance. It's covered by, all the legal structures that are in place already. The current state of the art of virtual care and remote monitoring involves, sending information to a clinician so that they can act on it, and is not really sort of automated diagnostics or automated treatment yet. That's still the realm of science fiction, sort of automated physicians that sort of do all the work for you and deliver care without a human being in the loop. At this point, what virtual care does is it gives clinicians superpowers, but you're just doing your same old, you're providing care the same way that you always have. You're just doing it now in a more efficient way with sort of the ability to do it at a distance. But provided that the requirements for the compliance in the various ways are met for both CMS and HIPAA, then this is a very well-established way to deliver care at this point. So the two things you're looking for is a comprehensive deployment agreement that is speaks to this, and then what's called a business associate agreement, or BAA. That is required, and that is sort of what establishes the baseline for privacy compliance or HIPAA compliance. Beyond that, we can give some more insight on that if there's further questions about that. But with that, I'm at 1:59, 2 o'clock, so I think I'm out of time. But thank you so much for all of your attention. It's been wonderful.
Yes, that is all the time we have left for today. Thank you so much again to our speakers for an excellent presentation, and to CloudDX for sponsoring today's webinar. CloudDX will be sharing the guide to the RPM billing and other educational resources with you following today's webinar. And to learn more about the content presented today, please go ahead and check out the resources section on your webinar console, and please fill out the post-webinar survey. Thank you again so much for joining us, and we hope you have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.